And of course, I will begin this afternoon by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and the region. But welcome all of you to this evening's event. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome, of course, to the ambassadors and high commissioners here with us tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. We're always glad to have you here. Now, authoritarian regimes, those with capabilities that often match or even exceed our own, and often using proxy actors in the private sector, are increasingly using cyber attacks and cyber-enabled operations to disrupt, to disable, to coerce, and to steal from others. We've seen this in the cyber offensives that Russia has launched against Ukraine, and these are inseparable, of course, from the wider invasion. And we've seen it also in China's many and varied intrusions against countries, including Australia. And as strategic competition intensifies the use of cyber as a weapon that is difficult to attribute, difficult to deter, and quite difficult to respond to, is quite a perfect fit for regimes that prefer to operate in environments without clear rules and norms and a lot of uncertainty. And yet the world continues to move slowly, too slowly, in establishing those rules and norms. Even public discussion and acknowledgement of cyber capabilities is scant, making debate about what is acceptable and unacceptable even more difficult. And technology is the key to the current era of strategic competition. And so collaboration between governments and industry is as important or more important than ever. As director of the Sydney Dialogue, I cannot, of course, miss this opportunity to mention the Sydney Dialogue Forum on the 4th and 5th of April this year, which will bring together the world's leading thinkers and actors across government, industry and civil society to talk about the why and the how of this collaboration and to work on priorities to pursue the opportunities and to minimise risk. It is really vital that responsible nations work together to shape technology rules and norms according to our set of values. ASPI is contributing to this effort through its research, through establishing dialogues at all levels and in different configurations, including a capstone and global effort, of course, the Sydney Dialogue, and through events like this one. I'm very much looking forward to this evening's discussion on the geopolitical and technical changes reshaping cyber risk. Now, tonight I will briefly introduce our panellists and we will play a recorded message by Dr Mart Noorma. He is the director of the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defence Centre of Excellence. Following his remarks, each of our panellists will deliver some brief remarks too. And we will then have a moderated Q&A session and we will open to the audience for questions. So please begin to think of any questions that you have, and as the conversation proceeds, I hope that some will be stimulated, and for online viewers, please make sure that you submit your questions. They can be put through as well. So I am delighted to be joined by such distinguished panellists, including our special guest, Vice Minister, Mr Marcel de Vink. He is the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from the Netherlands. He's travelled an extraordinarily long way to be with us tonight, and we are very grateful. Also delighted to be joined by Johanna Weaver, Director of the Tech Policy Design Centre at the Australian National University. Online tonight, we have Agnes Kasper, Chief of Law Branch, the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defence COE. She will be joining us virtually, of course. And Hugh Watson, Assistant Secretary of Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology Branch, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Australia. We will now proceed to the opening remarks by Dr Mart Noorma.
Dear participants, I am very proud to speak to you from behalf of the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defence Centre of Excellence, the NATO CCDCOE. Our 39 member nations are working together to be ready to face the cyber threats as a coalition. We truly believe it is very important that our like-minded nations would be able to support each other at the time of need. And there is no time to wait. Digitalization of our society gives us enormous benefits, but unfortunately, it makes us more and more vulnerable to the attacks from those who want to steal from us or just harm us. It has been predicted that the global damage to the world economy from cyber attacks will reach $10 trillion per year in a few years. Countless criminal and terrorist groups and individuals put our cybersecurity at test every day. Furthermore, some of them are sponsored by the governments, and some of them are governments. Cyber defense addresses mainly state and state-sponsored threat actors. Depending on their origin, those actors have geopolitical or ideological motivation. However, masked behind the ideology, they might be just thieves, working for their own financial gain and paying overheads to their dictators. Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014. Since then, Russia has constantly contested Ukrainian sovereignty in cyber domain. In late 2021, the cyber war transformed into a preparatory operation for what we now know as the first multi-domain war in human history, which has the cyber domain heavily integrated into operations. Today, the brave soldiers of Ukraine are standing against the forces of evil. NATO and our 39 nations are determined to give them our best support. Ukraine is in process of becoming a full member of our CCDCOE in the near future. We at NATO CCDCOE focus on supporting our nations in development of their cooperative cyber operation capability. Together with many stakeholders from our nations, we have identified 5 lines of effort that have the most significant effect on the cyber resilience of our nations. We call them the 5 capabilities. First, all nations need to be capable to conduct cyber operations independently. However, a common framework for cyber operations would provide the nations with a helpful guidance in continuous improvement of their cyber operations capability. We work with the nations to bring together the best practice and lessons learned to help our nations to achieve their capability development goals more efficiently. Secondly, our nations need to be capable to conduct multi-domain cyber operations. Cyber domain is the newest warfighting domain and still in rapid development. Cyber can be in supportive role to, for example, operations in the land domain. In addition, it can be just the other way around, for example, special operating forces supporting cyber operations. One way or another, in order to integrate cyber effects into joint operations, appropriate processes have to be developed, implemented, and validated. Thirdly, our nations need to be capable to conduct multinational cyber operations. The first step to cooperation is knowledge about your partner. The elements of the common framework of cyber operation developed in CCDCOE cooperations are providing them mutual understanding. Next, there has to be trust between the counterparts from all cooperating nations. Education, training, and exercises of our center brings the personnel of the nations closer together and provides a foundation of trust for the future cooperation. Fourthly, our nations need to be capable to carry out cyber activities in military, civilian cooperation. It is almost impossible to keep our cyberspace safe without continuous cooperation between civilian and military stakeholders. From the moment of a cyber incident, we need to establish if this is an act of criminality or act of war. The efficiency and the effect of our response depends on achievement of this clarity as quickly as possible. Also, it is very important to practice cooperation between military and civilian cyber actors in different situations, ranging from peace to crisis and wartime. Fifthly, our nations need to be capable to conduct cyber operations in public-private partnership. Different from any other warfighting domain, in the cyberspace, industry not only develops the systems, but also mostly owns and controls them. Recent events in Ukraine show the real power of cyber industry in a conflict. Established cooperation principles enable response that is more flexible. To conclude, we believe that the cooperation of our 39 like-minded nations on those 5 capabilities is the key to be strategically prepared to stand against all the future cyber threats as a coalition. I thank you all and wish you safe and secure cyberspace. Thank you.
Terrific. That was a good, if somewhat illuminating, and of course, real appraisal of where we're at. Look, I would like to mention that today has been brought together as a collaboration between the Embassy of the Netherlands, the Embassy of Croatia, and in particular in their role as NATO contact point embassies in Australia. And they've done that in conjunction tonight, of course, with the Embassy of the Netherlands. So that is why you have who you have before you today. And thank you for working with ASPI on this. Did we have some opening remarks from the panel, or would we prefer to go straight into questions? You prepared for some opening remarks? Straight into questions. Righto, that's always good. Mr. De Vink, aren't you lucky? You're in the chair closest to me, so I'm going to start with you. As I noted, of course, Dr. Noorma has painted a somewhat oblique picture of the challenges that we face. You in your role look at geopolitical developments every day. What are your views on the geopolitical context that we're headed into? Where is this going, and how are you seeing intersecting developments in cyberspace and other new emerging technologies?
Thanks a lot, Rebecca, and let me say thanks to ASPI for this great event. I had the opportunity to meet a number of the people working here, and I was really impressed with the work you're doing. So thank you again very much. On the question, Dr. Noorma referred a number of times to the war in Ukraine, and I think it's interesting that we've seen a lot of cyber activity there. I think it started out even before the war with taking out the Viasat communications. And that had actually not just an impact on Ukraine, but also on Germany and even on the port of Rotterdam, which, as you know, is an important main port in the Netherlands. It was limited, but it does show to what extent it can actually escalate also conflict. And I think Dr. Noorma also said, you need to be able to establish very quickly, is this an act of war? This was a spillover, you can say, from an aggression against Ukraine, but it does show how such an event can actually get out of hand. I think Dr. Noorma rightly said that Ukraine has been able to withstand all the Russian cyber operations that mostly go actually hand in hand also with conventional warfare. Mm-hmm. They've been doing this because they've been playing defense against Russia for many years, even before 2014. So they were very able to withstand that, and actually that's in a way also encouraging. I mean, it does demonstrate how critical cyber has become in warfare operations, but it's not impossible to defend oneself against that. And I think for us, it's really important to learn from that experience, to see, gain more expertise, ramp up our capabilities, but also making sure that we can collaborate with others to resist these kinds of attacks. I think you said what's happening more in the geopolitical realm. I think here in this part of the world, we also see a lot of geopolitical tension, and so I think it is incredibly important that we learn from one another. But also build coalitions, establish the framework that Dr. Noorma was also referring to. We have a toolbox within the EU. We have a toolbox within NATO, and the center is part of that. But I think we should also make sure that we have that we establish coalitions in which we can work together to be more effective in countering cyber aggressions.
Thank you for some excellent comments there. You're referring, of course, to what we're seeing in a lot in cyber, but also in a lot of new emerging technologies, which is just these blurry lines and an inability to easily characterize action that we're seeing. And again, your references to coalitions and frameworks. This is all about action, right? So it's, these are very important things. They're not being established for the sake of it. They are to enable a response. Now, Johanna, if we move just a little bit away from the geopolitical, but not terribly far, what do you make of the challenges like those that were really highlighted by the way that Elon Musk behaved when he threatened to stop funding and providing Starlink, that space-based internet, to Ukraine? A difficult question, but an important one, because we really are seeing private sector actors get directly involved in warfare and on the battlefield, and often without the filter of a government. So that particular situation, I'd love to know what you make of it. But billionaires generally, who might operate essential cyber infrastructure, just a small question, essential cyber infrastructure, and whose business interests might dictate that they act a way that is perhaps not aligned with the rules-based order or our collective interests. Some comments for you on that?
Well, luckily for everyone in the room, I've just come back from 7 days of digital detox. Otherwise, you would be hearing me rant about Elon Musk and Twitter. But I think, I guess the first thing I'd say about the threat that arose from Musk suggesting that he may withdraw the services unless they were paid for, of course, that arose because of the Viasat hack. So, this was because Russia took aggressive action, which meant that the infrastructure that would normally have been available to Ukraine, it should have been available to Ukraine, was not available. So we need to put it in that context. The other thing I think when we talk about the private sector and in the context of the international rules-based order, when we talk about the international rules-based order, we all know vaguely what we're talking about, but let's be honest that Russia and China are on a mission to rewrite the rules-based international order. So when we're asking private sector actors to do the right things by the international rules-based order, we're actually asking them to pick a side. And that does have geopolitical and commercial implications. And people so often focus on the commercial implications and the decisions of that, but it also has geopolitical implications. And there are many examples of the private sector working in the context of Ukraine and working really and taking quite courageous action. So if you think about, for example, the cybersecurity firms that were on the ground as the missiles were coming down in Kiev. If you think about the actions that were taken by MasterCard, by Visa, by SWIFT, the international banking infrastructure, which really basically crippled Russia's ability to participate in the international economic system. These were actions by the private sector that did very much align with our interests. So, and the other thing, Musk, Starlink is still in Ukraine. So I think there is the public threat, and then there is the action that is followed. Two lessons, though, that I would say come out of this. One is that when you are looking at the geopolitical and commercial choices that come out of engagement with the private sector, we need to acknowledge that for some of us, that means less diversification, whereas for others, it will mean more diversification. What do I mean by that? In Australia, we've taken a decision to exclude high-risk vendors from our 5G network, for example. For the result of that, whilst it's a country-agnostic policy, is that Chinese vendors are excluded from our 5G network. There are many countries in our region, however, who would see being wholly dependent on a Western provider just as risky as being dependent on a Chinese provider. So I think we need to broaden our mind when it comes to the strategic implications of public-private sector cooperation. And then the second point I would make on that, the key lesson that I take from Ukraine, and here I slightly differ from the director's assessment, is that industry, the cooperation between industry and warfighters is not new. That's why we have the military-industrial complex, right? What is different in cyberspace is that we don't have the level of maturity in the way that we cooperate during active armed conflict. And when you look at many of the early reports that came out of the conflict in Ukraine, whether it was those cybersecurity operatives on the ground at the early stages, whether it was things like the IT army or use of hacktivists, national-based hacktivists, for example, the reality is this will be a feature of future conflict. And whilst it's incredibly difficult, I understand from an operational perspective, from a legal perspective, we must as nations not just be focusing on what we need to do to cooperate together, but we also need to be looking at how do we harness those non-traditional actors in defending our nations, because they will be vital if Australia is in a situation of direct conflict, for example.
I think you made some really interesting points there. One that I think is really important is that some companies are showing that they really do care about their reputation, and it's not just about profit. That's important. It's not all of them, but some of them are absolutely focused on aligning, and that reputation matters. You also talked about the hacktivist movement, and I would like to get into that a little bit more later because the legal framework around that is incredibly interesting and difficult. Ms. Casper, if I may turn to you. So does this new reality that is demonstrated so clearly in Ukraine of both highly irresponsible state behaviour as well as private sector actors having this extraordinary level of access and influence in war zones mean that the normative framework for military operations is outdated? And can you talk a little bit about how the cyber domain differs from the more traditional conventional military domains that have more of a physical or a geographic character to them? As we're not getting your sound, can I get you to hold for a moment?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. So first I would like to thank the organizers and ASPI for inviting me to this very distinguished panel. So to your questions, basically there are quite many differences between the cyber domain and so to say traditional military domains. Let me start from that. The cyber is artificially constructed and constantly under development environment, and that means that it can be managed and mitigated by manipulation of the domain itself. It's also largely globally interconnected. It's ubiquitous and dual use, as we can characterize it, and it's under substantial control of non-state actors. It's also a hyper-competitive environment, so that dictates the tempo, the operational tempo. But one thing that I would also like to emphasize here, that cyber operations, you don't see them with your eyes. It's difficult to notice that they are going on. So there is this stealth character to it. So which is why it can be a bit of misleading, or we can draw. We need to be careful what kind of conclusions we draw from seeing or not seeing some activities. So although there has not been this kind of very cataclysmic event in cyber, what some of the experts would have expected or predicted in the Ukrainian-Russian war, cyber still has been a very central part to this illegal war in Ukraine. It's critical part of warfare, and it has been. Cyber has been used alone and in conjunction with kinetic attacks. So it's present in both in defense side and offense side. And what also we can observe in this conflict is the hyper internationalization of warfare. So in terms where the targets have been, you can see targets outside of these physical conflict zones in terms of drawing volunteers. So The IT army, for example, have been mentioned before, the involvement of private sectors. So, and there's been also influencing in countries that have not been belligerents in the conflict. So, and that all has an implication, whether we see that the risks, has they been changed, or how to characterize, whether these changes reshaping the cyber risks. So from many perspectives, probably we can see that these have effect in how we measure, how we assess risks. But it brings me to your provocative question that normative frameworks are outdated. Some things have not changed. It's critical that international law applies to cyber operations. This includes both peacetime international law and, so to say, the below the use of force threshold, as well as to regimes governing the use of force in international humanitarian law. So it's critical to remember that this is in Ukraine, international armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So, the laws of armed conflicts apply to that, and it applies to cyber operations as well. So, but we also need to see what is the role of international law here. It's international law never meant to provide answer to every single question. It certainly has its limitations, especially how it applies to cyber operations, when there are some points that need clarification, for sure. However, in this situation, where Russia's aim is to dissolve the rule-based world order, one might ask that what discussion is worth about any kind of new rules. So we have to call for respect of laws and norms that already have been agreed by states. And we certainly cannot say that this is an entirely new thing and current laws and norms do not apply. So international law does apply to cyber operation. The debate is rather how it applies. And one can point out that international law has this ability that to adjust new technologies, including cyberspace. So we need to look how cyber is being used in warfare, but also we need to look at the impact on the population. For example, what qualifies as the use of force, what is armed attack? So what are these thresholds? Then we can look at what responses are available to violations of international law. How can you create credible deterrence against malicious cyber activities while still fully respecting international law? International humanitarian law applies to cyber operations and in the context also of this current war. And I need to say that IHL, international humanitarian law, is agnostic about the type of weapons that are being used. So when it comes to private sector actors and such as IT armies, international humanitarian law already provides rules, for example, on the direct participation of civilians in hostilities. International humanitarian law decades ago have considered civilian participation in the hostilities. But as a baseline, it also requires respect for principles of humanity, proportionality, precaution, and distinction. So what makes the question particularly challenging is, again, the hyper-internationalization of the conflict and the parallel applicability of various potentially conflicting legal regimes. For example, when it comes to the application of national criminal laws and parallel applications to it. While the rules are there, ultimately, states will have to figure out how to operationalize these rules. So it is ultimately the states who make international law. So it will be up to them to move forward. So they will have to speak up. They will have to let their positions on the application and the interpretation of international law know. But eventually breaches of international law need to be called out, including how cyber operations are breaches of international law. So we can call on states who are responsible for the implementation of such rules. This requires transparency by states in what they consider acceptable target and behavior of cyberspace. So to quickly conclude, there are existing norms and rules which should be respected, and where there is a need for clarification, we should work towards that without undermining existing norms and rules that are already there. Thanks.
A very comprehensive response. Just to fair warning, I might come to you on this one as well for just an extended comment, if you don't mind. But some of the things you mentioned there, LOAC does, of course, the laws of armed conflict and international humanitarian law does, of course, in most states have stated as a policy principle that they believe they extend into cyberspace and indeed into space. The difficulty, of course, as you have said, is with implementation. Are you talking about capabilities that we're using every day in our lives on our computers at home and weaponizing them? The invisibility of the action, the inability sometimes to attribute and track the fact that you could, a person physically used to go to a battlefield, and that still does happen, of course, but you could see them physically partake in a battle here. There are thousands of people all around the world operating behind VPNs. That are effectively taking part in a war. Can I get you to maybe offer a few extra comments on this one?
Yeah, just briefly, because I think Dr. Casper made a couple of very valid and important points, and I think, as she said, international law does actually apply to cyber operations. There's been extended negotiations within the UN on a normative framework that's been established. We, as the Netherlands, have always been a very strong proponent of that. And so I think whenever those norms are being violated, it is incredibly important that we take also action. And calling out those who've violated those norms. That is not easy because you need to attribute that, but I think we're getting better at that, as time progresses, and I think the naming and shaming of state actors and others that are doing this is incredibly important. One might think, but what does that really mean? And we know that some of the state actors actually, do they really care? In the end, they do. And we've seen also in the war in Ukraine how incredibly important it is that in the UN we've called out and we condemned Russia a number of times with a large number of nations, behind resolutions, and that's been very important in the narrative, making sure that we have the support from as many countries as possible, and this is actually also what you do in the cyber context.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, Hugh, you're probably feeling a little bit left out over there, but we're not going to keep it that way for long. Both Dr. Noorma and Mr. Vink have offered us something of a challenge. In your view, are like-minded nations ready to stand up against cyber threats as a coalition? You've been knee-deep yourself in several attributions of cyber attacks. What are the next steps when it comes to like-minded states standing up to and responding to cyber threats?
Yeah, thanks very much. And can I add my thanks to ASPI and to the embassies of the Netherlands and Croatia for hosting tonight. And it's a privilege to be a part of the panel. I'm going to pick up on actually a couple of things that have already been touched on by Mr. De Vink and Dr. Casper, and also by Dr. Weaver as well. So I think there are a couple of areas in which states can work together to stand up to cyber threats. One of those areas is increasing the understanding of and awareness of those rules that are in place governing state behaviour in cyberspace. And Dr. Casper's already spoken in detail about the international legal framework and international humanitarian law and its application. Mr. Vink has also spoken about the fact that we have already in the UN agreement that this framework, not just of law, but norms and rules and principles applies. So I'll speak a little bit in detail about what we can do in that area to bed down acceptance and understanding that that framework applies and that states need to be held accountable to that. And then the second area is, which has also been mentioned, is the need to take action together and impose costs when those rules are broken. So on the first point, in terms of bedding down rules and norms in that framework of responsible state behaviour, all states have agreed, actually, at the UN that that framework exists and applies. We had last year the adoption of the progress report of the open-ended working group on security of and in the use of information and communications technologies, which built on a number of different reports from UN groups of government experts establishing those principles. So all states have accepted that. We now have an opportunity to take that further at the UN because recently there's been established a new program of action which will follow on from the open-ended working group, which will be a single permanent and inclusive and action-oriented body dedicated specifically to the discussion of application of that framework. And that's a useful place where like-minded countries can work together to deepen the understanding of all countries and acceptance of all countries of those principles of international law and norms and rules. It's in our interest to ensure that there's really robust modalities around that new mechanism, the program of action, and that those discussions in that forum really reinforce the framework for states' behaviour and the need for states to be held accountable when that framework is breached. But of course, as we've heard, despite the existence of that framework and those rules, we continue to see malicious cyber activity and states continuing to use with increased sophistication cyber means to attack critical national infrastructure, for example, as a means of hybrid warfare. And we've seen that, of course, in the Ukraine. Actions like those, of course, threaten international peace and security and are unacceptable. And those actors should be held to account when they act contrary to that framework. So the second area in which like-minded countries can work together is to stand up by imposing costs when the framework's broken and to deter future threats of that nature. And there are a number of different areas of deterrence action where we can work together. So one area is in denial practices, that is increased cyber security to increase the costs for perpetrators who try to launch malicious cyber action. So we can ensure that we enhance our own cybersecurity, but we can also work together to build the cybersecurity capacity of vulnerable countries as a way of deterring malicious cyber activity. Secondly, we can work on signalling together, that is being transparent about what we consider to be the consequences for bad behaviour, what we're going to do when we detect malicious cyber activity, so that we can be aligned and strong in our statements that we will actually take action when malicious cyber activity is conducted by other states. And finally, responsive action. So working together on things like attribution, which has already been mentioned, calling out countries that flout the rules, and also not just public naming and shaming, as Mr. Vink has described, but also going down the route of, for example, sanctions and working together to be aligned when we impose cyber sanctions. And so like-minded countries can work together on those things to increase the cost for actors who breach the framework that we've all agreed to. And I'll leave it there for now.
Excellent, thank you. It's a nice segue actually to the next question that I want to ask, which is of you, Johanna. You spent a lot of time as Australia's UN representative working to advance cyber norms. You were tireless in your efforts. I watched you from defence when you were in DFAT, and you know, massive kudos for an enormous sustained effort that I really think did move things along. So well done. When you look at the geopolitical context that we're talking about, what reflections do you have on the norms that we have in place? And to Hugh's point, are we seeing cyber attacks and malicious activities being counted? Is it like for like, cyber back against cyber? Or are today's sort of conflicts and competitions, really truly multi-domain, where you could get a response to a cyber attack in any domain?
So it's a lot in that question. I think the first point that I always make when we talk about this, so the negotiations that Rebecca was talking about there, I spent a lot of time negotiating with the Russians, the Chinese, the US, allies, the EU. We got to the point where we have agreement in a UN document that international humanitarian law applies to cyber operations. That is a momentous achievement to have got to that point. But I am very clear-eyed about the fact that that does not mean that international humanitarian law is going to be respected in cyberspace. And I think it's really important to agree the rules, but we also have to then uphold the rules, which is to Hugh's point that he's making there. A big part of that is declaring offensive cyber capabilities. And, I think the Netherlands is coming on in that respect. Australia has been quite transparent about this for a long time, since 2006, that we have capabilities, that we use the capabilities, but we use them in accordance with the rules that we have agreed at the United Nations. That is so important and so powerful. It totally distinguishes us from Russia and China, who continue, despite all evidence to the contrary, to deny on the floor of the United Nations and in other public forums that they possess or use those capabilities. So the fact that we say openly that we have the capabilities, but we commit to using them in accordance with the rules and norms is really important, and we must continue to do that. Doesn't mean we're going to disclose our state secrets. It doesn't mean we're going to disclose details of particular operations. But in the same way that we say we have missiles and we use them in accordance with international law, we have offensive cyber operations and we use them. I think that's really, really important. When it comes to enforcement, Russia is violating the most fundamental principle of international law, state sovereignty. So the idea that Russia is not violating international humanitarian law in cyber operations, of course they are in Ukraine. And what will be really interesting out of the ICJ conference that will be happening in the UK in March is to watch and see Viktor Zora, who's been leading, the Vice Minister who's been leading a lot of the Ukrainian cyber defense efforts, has signaled publicly several times that they have evidence of Russian cyber operations that they say equates to war crimes. Now, there's a lot of skepticism about that, but it's interesting when you listen to very carefully to what he's saying. He's saying it's the combination of the cyber operations being used in conjunction with kinetic operations, which are having a direct impact on civilian populations. So it's not saying that the cyber operations themselves are constituting war crimes, but the combination. I think that's really something for anyone who's particularly interested on international legal principles for us to keep an eye on. This idea of is cyber part of hybrid operations? Is it going to be a standalone? To me, this is just a really strange semantic debate, the fact that we're still having this debate. The equivalent to me would be saying, okay, when we had the domains of sea and land, and we suddenly added air capabilities, the idea that suddenly all warfighting will transfer into air and the other two domains would disappear is ludicrous. And I think too many people equate cyber operations with replacing all other domains. Of course it's not going to, but it will be used in conjunction, and there's a lot of evidence that that is happening on the ground in Ukraine, for example. Likewise, the idea that cyber operations need to be responded to with cyber operations, I think just is something that doesn't reflect the reality in peacetime or in wartime. So, Hugh's talking about malicious cyber activity that may fall below the threshold of use of force. And we may respond with sanctions rather than cyber operations. If a piece of malware is used to shut down a power station in Ukraine, we may respond with a missile. This is again, equating a special forces operation to take out a bridge with saying you have to respond with a special forces operation. Of course, we're not going to do that. So I think it's about bringing some depth to the way that we think about the way that cyber operations are used in conjunction with all of the other domains, and that's something that Ukraine is really emphasising. Final thing I'll say, and this may sound strange coming from the person who spent most of her time negotiating the law, I would really also like to bust the myth that all nations need to agree on every single element of international law as it applies to cyberspace. If you asked a bunch of lawyers from a bunch of different countries to get in a room and tell me what the principle of application of Article 5 for NATO, the lawyers couldn't agree one single application for it. This is taking out cyber. So stop setting a bar that is so much higher when it comes to cyber than we have in other domains. The important thing is we know what each other's interpretation is, and we can use that in our calculations to consider our responses and escalatory responses, for example. I'll stop my rant there.
That's a really excellent point, Johanna, and thanks for making it. It's true. Cyber is different, but it's also, there is a lot of continuity with the other military domains. Ms. Casper, I'd like to come back to you if I could for reflections on anything that you've heard so far, but as well, how have you seen the Tallinn manual, which we haven't named so far in this conversation? I think Johanna has said before that almost everybody had a copy of this and was doing their reading of this catching up through COVID, and that is, of course, one big indicator of influence. So is the fact that I think in the space domain they have taken very much a similar approach to try and work through the issues in the space domain. So how influential do you see the Tallinn manual has been, and any other reflections on what you've heard so far?
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, when Johanna was talking about that, we don't have to agree on a single set of rules, I couldn't agree more. And the best example what demonstrates this is exactly the Tallinn manual, right? Because what does it do? Yeah, it's a tool for legal advisors, and I hope that help states to formulate their opinions on how international law applies. But when you open the Tallinn manual and read it, it's a very nice mapping of what applicable rules are or could be. It's definitely not law, but it tells us how the law could be. Yeah. And what's after these black letter rules that are identified, it also provides a catalog of various arguments of how exactly international law could be understood. And this is exactly fits very well with Johanna's argument that there are majority views on certain things, and there are minority views on certain things. So it provides good ways, good tool for legal advisors who are actually there and their day-to-day work. They have to provide advice on cyber operations. It provides a good catalog that, okay, you can use this argument or you can use that argument. So in that sense, I believe the Tallinn manuals have been very useful in aiding these state opinions from these processes in general. So arguments are provided. So which brings me to the next point here, that Tallinn Manual 2.0 has been out since 2017, and you may know that the Tallinn Manual 3.0 process also has begun. So that also tells me that first there is demand for that, yeah. So not only because there is a need for updating the rules. Technology may have changed in these last 6 years, and there may be some new areas that could be considered in the tele-manual process, but also it was only after the tele-manual 2.0's publication that states really started to speak up, that and actually started to publicly state their opinions on exactly those issues that have been in the tele-manual, or how sovereignty applies, what may be violation of sovereignty, is this a rule or a principle, right? What is the meaning of due diligence and the use of force, and many other things. So states started to actually engage in this interpretation of international law publicly, which is a very big difference, because in the tele-manual processes, there has been state consultations, but those have been confidential, right? But confidential and secret law is no law. So now the difference is that these statements are public. So this gives very good ground for the team, yeah, to actually take another look at what has changed, what state opinion, what state practice is there since 2017, and the tele-manual and its rules could be updated based on this actual state practice. So.
Thank you very much. So it's a number of you now have really pointed out that despite the fact that there is, I think you said it's universal country commitment to the fact that the laws of armed conflict apply, and international humanitarian law, of course, applies in cyberspace. Really, we don't need exact agreement to act, right, or on when we're interpreting any particular action or a situation. What I'd like to ask you, Mr. Vink, and also you, Hugh, if you wouldn't mind, to reflect on your particular country's approaches here. But the Netherlands is known for bringing together several initiatives that really focus on like-minded actors as the foundation for building this stronger consensus and a more stable and a secure playing field. How do you think these are going to help us overcome some of the challenges that people have been talking about today? And again, to you, Hugh, I guess we could take a bit of a regional approach, or just an Australian lens to the same question that I've asked the Netherlands.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think both Johanna and you have spoken to that. But I think the most important thing is, and I think the lessons that we take from the war in Ukraine will actually help us with that, is to take action and to make sure that we move away from the sort of theoretical debate into, so what do we do against those who do not abide by the rules and the norms? And you said a number of things, I think, and Johanna also. I think what we want to make sure is that we have a toolbox available that we can take diplomatic action, and not just diplomatic, also real action. Because now it's often now
diplomatic action, isn't
not
it?
the diplomatic action, exactly, some real action. Exactly, this is jet lag kicking in. I'm putting myself out of work, which is not a good thing. No, but we've responded mostly with statements, and actually it takes us a very long time to come up with these kinds of statements. Yeah. Really, even months after the fact. That's it's hard to believe that that's being taken seriously by our adversaries. So we need to make sure, and that's also, we need to make sure that we signal that we're serious about that. Johanna said something about that, but also make sure that they know what the response is going to be.
Yeah.
But that requires a lot of work, because you said, so what can we do more? We need to make sure and this is something that we can only do with a relatively small group of like-minded countries. To develop that kind of action. I think we need to put a lot of work into making sure that we, into the trust, but also into what kind of response we develop. Another thing that we really need to do is to build the capacities of those countries that, do not have the house in order, that are actually very vulnerable to attacks, cyber attacks. You said that as well. That's also part of our toolbox. We established the Global Center for Cyber Assistance, and that's also available here in the Indo-Pacific region. And so I think we should get better at that and make that expertise available.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. You, I think, make a really good point. All of you have made a really good point tonight about, you need a core of like-minded nations to create at least something to work from. You can build out from that, but you at least need some kind of basis for agreement to take action. It's very difficult to take action when you don't all agree on what you've seen or what needs to happen. And I think before, what you were saying is diplomatic action is not enough on its own. It is more about this every tool in the toolkit kind of approach. So Hugh, over to you. Can you talk a little bit about Australia's approach and the way we're going after this problem?
Yeah, thanks, Beck, and completely agree with what Mr. Vink has just said. In fact, stole my talking points. No, I'll just elaborate a little bit on that, because I think exactly as you say, Beck, we need to, especially when we're responding to malicious cyber activity and through the action of attribution, which, as Mr. Vink reflected, actually takes quite a long time to do. It loses weight when it's the same group of countries. Every time, same group of like-minded Western European countries that are making these statements. So I think a key challenge for us is to broaden that coalition and include more, or draw more countries from our region, particularly the Indo-Pacific region, into that action of joint attribution, because it gives it more weight when it's a more geographically diverse bunch that is engaged in that. But of course, there are going to be a number of countries that are never going to be comfortable joining in attribution. So the other thing that we can be doing is encouraging our partners in the region to be conducting work below the public level. So attribution doesn't necessarily need to be public. It can be conducted through diplomatic démarches behind the scenes, and that's also effective. But a third point is that we tend to be quite ad hoc in the way that we respond to cyber activity. That is, we wait for we have a major incident, then we conduct the work of determining whether we can attribute that incident to a particular state actor. That all takes a long time. We need to be engaged in constant engagement with those countries that we consider to be engaging in behaviour that is contrary to agreed norms and principles, not just when we make public statements, but also in the same way behind the scenes, diplomatically, and pointing out the patterns of activity that we're seeing. So it needs to be a sustained approach, not just when there are incidents that occur. And I also wanted to agree completely with what Mr. Vink said about capacity building, because that's a big priority for Australia, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. And there are different ways that you can lift capacity. You can lift capacity of networks and systems. You can train government and also the community and lift up their awareness of cyber threats. But you can also enhance the capacity of countries to engage in the sorts of debates that we have at the UN about the application of international law and the need for that to be respected. And that's another area that we need to continue to invest in order to generate a greater number of countries who are prepared to speak out and take action when the framework is breached.
Excellent. Look, thank you all for your comments so far. I feel like I have, I've had a good run. It's time to hand over to you in the audience. I'm going to go to an online question first to give you time to get your hands in the air. There will be a roving mic, and if you do have a question, please stand, state your name and any association, and if your question is for a particular panellist, please identify that. So we do have a question from Owen online. How can middle power states best preserve their geopolitical interests without being reliant on large power states for their defence in the cyber domain? Johanna, I'm looking at you.
Look, I spend a lot of time engaging with what I call middle ground countries. So if you look at the Economic Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, there's about 21 countries that sit as full-blown democracies. It's about 37 that sit as full-blown authoritarian regimes. And then you have the countries in the middle who sort of may sway one way or the other, but they haven't really picked their side, or they may publicly have picked but are leaning the other way. Those countries are not quite the same as middle power countries. I think the key thing for many of those countries is going to be diversification when it comes to cyber power. This idea that we depend, very different to the approach that Australia has taken with, strong Western allies and saying, okay, we're putting our bet here and that's where we're going. Many of those middle ground countries won't do that. They will look to have cyber infrastructure that is from both sides, if you're looking at it in a very black and white picture. But also many of those middle ground countries are developing their own infrastructure. Look at countries like India, for example, who has recognised the enormous economic potential of acting as a third option between Western tech and Chinese tech, for example. So I think there are many opportunities that are available for middle powers to exert power and influence when it comes to the cyber domain. When it comes to negotiations in the United Nations, the middle power countries hold the balance of power. So in the negotiations that we had that lasted for 2.5 years, yes, you have to get the great powers on board. That's the final cabal in the room. But you then have to take that out and ensure that those middle power countries middle ground countries will accept that. And that's why we spent so much time when I was then working for Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, working with countries like India and Indonesia, countries that really have influence and sway. And recognising that we must continue to engage in those UN discussions, not frankly because, this is my personal opinion, that we're going to make meaningful progress in further articulating the rules. We've agreed international law applies. That's the important thing, right? But we do need to defend that space in the United Nations, because if we're not there defending it, fighting tooth and nail to defend it, Russia and China will rewrite those rules. They will undo that agreement. So it's vitally important that we engage there. And then if we want to make real progress, the space to make real progress in influencing the development, a deeper understanding of how those rules apply, that's where our cooperation with like-minded partners and the middle ground becomes so important.
Yeah, and it's not just cooperation on rules and ideas, but it's cooperation on systems. I was very interested in that point you just made, because for these countries to be able to diversify, they need options to diversify too. So this comes back to the capacity building, but also to working really collaboratively to make sure those options exist beyond, say, Chinese tech or Russian tech. Did either of you want to add to that?
Well, I just realized, because of the comments that you made, that it's also incredibly important to make this part of the mainstream conversation that we have between one another, because actually now it's very much UN oriented. It's between experts. When I normally engage with a lot of other countries, and we do this all the time, actually this is not really part of the conversation as much as it should be, because it's such an important part of the dimension that we actually, I think today, for everyone here listening to this, it's very clear this is a very real thing. It's not just an abstract. It's part of the work that we should be doing on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything to add, Hugh? And online, Agnes, anything to add on that one? Nope, excellent. Okay, we do have a hand. We'll take this question at the front, please. Coming to you right now.
Hi, Rion. I study at the ANU, and I have a question. So after 9/11, the United States championed preemptive self-defense and preemptive offensive operations against terrorist regimes or countries seeking to support terrorism. Do you reckon that will translate into the cyberspace, and will that have to become, or is there a risk it becomes an essential part of the Western foreign policy against adversarial regimes? And another second question is that, so talking about India, India being a non-aligned country, specifically in the Ukraine versus Russia conflict, has recently shown its intention to continue to protect its own interests, which is important, but at the same time sort of ignore both calls from the West and other parts of the world to either support or not support Ukraine. So what is the risk of India in the cyberspace in terms of developing its own capabilities, where it becomes a threat to the region at large?
Thank you very much. Good questions. So to the doctrine of preemption and how much we are already seeing that in cyberspace, or may, and this conversation around India and its position and which way it may go. Who wants to take this one on?
I feel like I have the advantage because I don't work for a government, so so I'm happy to, unless anyone else wants to. So, look, I think on preemptive measures, the US has a doctrine of active cyber defense. They also have another term for it, which is escaping me at the moment, but if someone else can jump in with it. Pardon? Persistent engagement, thank you. So it is absolutely already part of the US's doctrine, and other countries are adopting that to differing effects. And it does raise real questions around the application of international law, questions of sovereignty, etc. But it is very much already part of the doctrine that sits around it. Again, this is really important about the signalling and the messaging around this, so that people understand that this is not something that will be a response that will be perpetrated against someone for no reason, but it is actually something that is happening because of a consequence that is being seen. It's a response to something, for example. I think the most interesting example of the use, or the most public example of the use of active measures, was operations conducted during the US elections against Russian troll farms, for example. So, they're publicly disclosed examples of action that was taken. It's really important, though, that when we talk about that we talk about it in the context and the framework of international law, so that other countries are not thinking, oh, well, the US or Australia or allies are going to be using these capabilities willy-nilly because they want to interfere in our domestic processes. That's not what those capabilities are there. It is active defense, and that is a really important qualifier to put around it. In terms of India and its response, I mean, on the one hand, I think, India is an independent sovereign nation. They will continue to operate in their best interests. What we need to do as countries and friends and allies that work around India is to continue to engage with them to make sure that they see that it is in their best national interests to take action that aligns with our national interest. It's not about convincing them to come around to our side. It's about saying, how do we ensure that our national interests align? India was one of my most enjoyable but most difficult counterparts to engage with through UN negotiations, because they were frank, because they said, we don't agree with your policy on declaring offensive cyber capabilities, and would talk about that. You have really great conversations that come from it, and then you can adopt and adjust your policies in that way. India fundamentally is a democracy, and so when you engage with Indian technologists, for example, I've spent a fair bit of time recently in India, and the way that Indian technologists talk about building technology that protects democracy, that protects the values that we stand for, gives me real hope and expectation that they will continue to align, not just from a policy perspective, but from the way that they're making their technology as well.
Excellent. Jason, I see you. I'm just going to quickly do a one online one, to be fair, and this one is for Hugh, and I think it's a really interesting one and an important one. What is the role for Australia or of Australia for the Pacific Island countries' cybersecurity? Can you hear?
Thanks, Beck. Yeah, that's right in the zone for us, because for Australia, and I touched on this before, a huge priority is working with our Pacific and Southeast Asian partners on uplifting cyber security. And mentioned before, and it's been mentioned by others too, a critical issue is the vulnerability of countries that where it plays into issues of cybersecurity for Australia and for other countries too, because we need to, when we're talking about uplifting cybersecurity, having a region that is more cyber secure translates to greater security for Australia as well. But stepping back from that, not even talking about the security dimension, having for Pacific countries and for Southeast Asian countries, having secure and stable access to the digital economy, of course, is a really important part of being able to tap into economic growth and economic development. So it's a priority for us to support countries that ask us to do so, to uplift their cybersecurity to enable that access, but also to lift the security of the region as a whole. And so we have a very, very extensive capacity building program which covers both the Pacific and Southeast Asia, over $100 million, 100 different projects, 56 of them are still ongoing at the moment, dedicated to working with our Pacific partners and our Southeast Asian partners on uplifting cybersecurity. And that covers, as I mentioned before, not just network and systems security, but also training, community awareness, ability to engage in multilateral processes. All of those things are important parts of cybersecurity capacity.
Excellent.
And for us, it's, as I said, important for development, but also security.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sophie, for that question online. Jason. You wondered what I was doing to you then, didn't you? I'm so sorry.
Thanks very much. Jason Brown, I'm the Principal Advisor to the Board of Talis on Risk and Security, but I'm also a member of the International Standards Committee for Cybersecurity, so I have an interest in this. My question has some context. Roughly 10 years ago, the Dutch government established the Hague Security Delta, which brought together only 4 or 5 companies originally, now 270, to look at security issues from combined business and academia. My question goes to 274 countries, I think, so companies, 274 countries today are in this Delta, and it brings all this stuff together. And I visited it, it was fabulous, talking with academics, talking with government officials. We don't have anything like that here. We have our cybersecurity centre. We have the odd CRC on cyber. The issue is, what are the capability gaps that partnerships, local and particularly global, can bring to Australia in parallel to the work happening with government? You can make a statement all you like, but if you haven't got the capability to back it up, not a lot going on. Yeah. So that's really the question. Capability, where's it going to come from? How are we going to nurture it? And how do we internationalise it? Thank you. Anyone can answer.
Anyone? Agnes, are you keen to take this one on from your perspective at the COE? Do you do any engagement or outreach with industry or private sector that you want to talk about?
Maybe I can have a short comment that, and if you recall Mart Noorma's introductory keynote speech, he was talking about also these joint capabilities, the capabilities to work along a common framework and the multi-domain operation as a coalition, and in together with civilian authorities, and the last one was basically about the public-private partnerships. So basically, the NATO CCDCOE's priority exactly to identify those gaps which basically where development or where we could work on how to engage with private sector, private companies. On the other hand, I know that the NATO CCDCO is engaging with the private sector. So in many of our activities already. So whenever we do conduct research, we reach out very often to private sector companies, consult to be aware of what's their perspective. We conduct exercises. One of the most well-known cyber exercises, the locked shields, for example. See, here we have very strong cooperation with the private sector. So we are basically there already. We are engaging with the private sector in that sense. Well, we also focus on how we can further develop this cooperation in order to provide these capabilities to our nations and our member nations and our partners. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Look, I'm aware that we're up against the clock, so I think we're almost there. There is a question that I cannot ignore online, so please feel free to answer with a one-word answer, but I'll put this to you all and you can say yes but as well. So from Luigi, with the increased use, speed and scale of grey zone cyber operations and deniability, is attribution as important as it once was in prosecution of malicious actors or nation states and as a deterrent?
In prosecution?
Yes.
Has
it been used in prosecution?
I just
don't think it has. Or we can substitute that word for in I think in responding to. Right. I think let's substitute that for responding to malicious actors or nation states. So
I think we need to bust the myth that attribution is hard. Attribution sometimes takes time, but it is possible. We have incredibly sophisticated capabilities. If we want to, we can attribute. The question is whether or not we want to throw the capabilities at it to attribute. And that is often a political resourcing question, and then the benefits that come and do not, may or may not flow from attribution. We can technically attribute. Whether we publicly then take a decision to attribute that is another question. But technical attribution is difficult, but it is not as impossible as people continue to perpetuate that it is.
Excellent. Anything to add?
One word, yes. And you said but. No, absolutely yes. Attribution continues to be important. And I think Australia's conducted 14 or so attributions since 2017 and will continue to. Engage in attribution where we have the evidence to support it. It takes time, but as I said before, it's important to hold states accountable to that framework that we've agreed on.
I'm going to jump in and add the but. It's not alone, right? We need to be complementing attribution with action. With action.
And we do need to do it faster.
Yeah.
And I think Johanna said capabilities because I think we're still scrambling in terms of capabilities. We don't throw enough capabilities at that.
Yeah.
And so yes, attribution is important, but we need to make sure that it doesn't stop there.
That's not all we do. Yep, absolutely. Agnes, I think we thank you so much for staying with us. Thank you for your comments tonight. Thank you to each of our panelists for an excellent conversation. I can't believe you're still standing. It's fantastic. There are some light refreshments, so please do continue the conversation. I think our panelists may stay around for a little while for a bit more of a chat too. So feel free to move. Thank you so much.
Thank you.